Good evening and welcome, and boy am I lucky. I absolutely loved these books. It's an honor to get to sit on the stage with these women and to talk to them about the two books. And I will start with a question that either one of you can pick up, because you both tell stories about carrying around these stories. In your acknowledgments, you talk about being nudged to write this, though clearly you lived with the memory and these thoughts every day. You carried your story for almost 2 decades, and it was a mentor who nudged you. Living with it, why do you think you needed to be nudged to get the story to come out?
Well, I can start. The way that it began was not with a nudge, but with writing in the aftermath of my husband's very, very unexpected passing. Writing literally to be grounded, to feel like I was still on the earth when I felt like the earth had been pulled out from underneath me. And it was very, very physical, the feeling of putting my hand to the page, that my feet were on the ground, that the table, my hand, there was a connection, and that somehow it meant that I was still standing as I was writing. And I never experienced or understood how physical and necessary the act of writing was for me, and how much it was about knowing what I was perceiving and what was happening, not even translating it or transforming it, but literally experiencing it through writing to know where I was. The nudge came later when an editor who I knew and admired, we'd never had a chance to work together, we tried, approached me knowing what happened and said, you know, if you don't want me to ask, I'll go away, but I think that you could write something very powerful if you chose to. And I felt that she knew my secret, which is that I was writing.
This.
Was that?
I hope so.
Okay. It was someone saying, I believe you can do this, which for me also meant taking away a kind of privacy that I prize, so it felt, writing in a genre that I hadn't written in before, and making something when so much was bereft, which at the end of the day turned out to be a very powerful thing to be able to do.
Yeah, I feel like there were so many attempts that I made to try and figure out in language what I needed to say to and about my mother. And I think I started almost immediately. I started in the year after her death working on poems when I was in grad school. But I was so close to that loss and so befuddled by what it meant and where it had left me that those poems were really failed attempts to bring her back, which is, not something, it's something that not even language is capable of doing. And I think I came back to that. I found a way to explore my relationship with her and explore the shape of her absence in my life in poems as I got a little bit older. And after a number of years, I realized that there were things that I wanted to be able to do in words that would take me past what I had developed a certain sense of confidence or comfort in doing in verse, in poems. I wanted to figure out how to not only ask questions, which I feel like my poems help me to do, but to tell some of the stories that would take me back to the person that I was then, and that would create a sense of my mother's voice and her presence for my daughter, who will never know her. And it was when I was pregnant with my daughter that I really decided, okay, I'm going to go back and really tell this story and take on the fear and the anxiety and also the curiosity that comes with that. What I realized in doing that was that all of these events that I'd lived with and kind of under the weight of, that felt so disparate and random and so blindingly bright that I couldn't quite even see what they had led to, all of those things created a kind of path that made me feel like I had lived a story. My life wasn't just a matter of having responded to these powerful events like leaving home or deciding that my wishes for myself were different from my mother's wishes for me, and processing all of that and the guilt of that too in the wake of her death. all of that created a continuum that didn't feel so haphazard and chaotic. It taught me a little bit about what I had been afraid to acknowledge when I was living with her. A big part of that had to do with the history that she and we were connected to, or are connected to. My mother, both of my parents came from Alabama, and they came of age during the pre-civil rights era South, and there were so many stories that I knew they could have told me that they and I shied away from. I think about that a little bit now, like in this past week, thinking about, all of the terrible injustices that we've witnessed, and the decisions that have kind of been heartbreaking. Thinking about Baltimore this past week and the proximity to racial violence and the proximity to, the ways that we live with and under the shadow of hate. When I was little, I felt like that was something that my parents stood between, kind of like blocking me from. And now I realize that it was something that was going on all around us, and my silence was really just a kind of fear to acknowledge that this is the world that we together are or were a part of. Somehow telling that story with calm and quiet and space and a little bit of secrecy, because not everybody was expecting me to do that. And this other voice saying, I'm here, I want to read what you've written, the mentor. It helped me listen to some of the things that I was afraid of for most of my life, and maybe even assert and claim my own connection to them. So.
Most readers know you both as poets, and in your book you talk about dealing with your mother's dying and death, and poetry becomes a solid shore almost. You name out the poets that give you a place. And many people might have expected you both to write about these issues through poetry. Why did you both pick prose?
I wanted to, this is what I believe poems help me to do. They help me to create a sense of presence and encounter and image that is powerful and visceral enough that not everything around it needs to be explained. They allow me to pick up from one point in time or one idea and leap over to another without walking the path between those two things. And there's something so exhilarating about that. There's a spark of departure and the surprise of arrival. But I wanted to fill in those gaps and say, not only did I see this or feel this, or not only has this been said, but this is what it made me think of, and this is what it made me ask, and these are the questions that I still have that have not been resolved, and this is what I wish I could have done in response to this real thing. I wanted to fill up some of that space with the truths that are so private and so subterranean that we can understand them without having ever fully articulated them to ourselves. So for me, it was really about telling myself all of these things in words that before that had probably had more of a visceral or emotional effect.
Yeah, when I was writing, I didn't know what would come out. It felt like it was coming from the same place that poems come from that same very visceral, swampy place where the words of poems live and the sounds of poems live. And then, as it started to come out in very concentrated chapters, but nonetheless chapters that added up to something longer, I became excited about what it felt like to have an organic form suggesting itself to me, and that there was another way to write, and I was discovering it just as I was going through this very, very unprecedented stage in my life, that there were ways that things could be different, that there were ways that things could be made that were commensurate with the enormity of what had happened. And then since it's been done, what I've been actually very pleased about is that there's a way that, because it leads story first, even though I care so much about the writing of it, it's actually feeling more accessible to more people. And just in the little bit of time that this book has been out, That has been very, very powerful and very, very interesting, and a quite fascinating and humbling and intense journey, you know, to meet people who come to the story with their own experiences of grief and of love and of joy and of loss. You know, it's not just the same experience, it's many, many, many different points of intersection. So in that regard, to be under the umbrella of memoir in the way that memoir calls people in, that's been very nice.
In talking about both books, there are key moments that sat with me about the break, the leaving, the moment of departure, as you call it. With your husband, it matters a lot to you to think about, he was there on the treadmill, he was there, he took my last breath, he was leaving in the ambulance, he was gone at the hospital. Tell me a little bit about that moment. It just seemed, the heart of it, the grip of it is what stayed with you, that journey.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, both of us have gone right to the scene, you know, because I think that for me there was something about not skirting it. I quote and thought a lot about the poet Michael Harper, where he says, you know, what is death but birth with complexity? You know, about the terror and beauty and holiness of that journey and what it meant to be a witness to it. I'm not glad I had to, but I felt that I was a witness to it. And I felt also in making this book and in telling the story, I'm always one to get to the point first. You know, I'm the one, if I know something like that's going to happen in a book, I'll go and find it, and then I'll go back. And so I thought I might as well control that process a little bit. So to sort of bear witness in the beginning and say, like, this is why we're here. But then in the next wave to say, this is why I want you to love this person. And just love this extraordinary, extraordinary person, and love the way that this family tried to make family, and love the way that this family tried in the day-to-day to make something that radiated outward beyond just the two of them or the four of them. So that was the next piece of work for the book to do.
And for you, so much of the book is the push-pull, your struggle to understand your mother and religion, its place with you. But there's a moment in those days of departure when you hear her talking, and she tells you with perfect clarity what she's hearing. And it's the one moment in the book where you seem to have no quibble, no back and forth. You are in this moment with her. It is pure.
It's so amazing the way that we have these different places where religion reaches us, and there's a place of where it's metaphor for those of us who accept it. And there's a place where there's skepticism, and we can say, well, this is a coping device, and this is, you know, something that brings families or communities together. And what I discovered when, you know, at the very end of my mother's life, she was lying in her bed and talking, and there was something I felt implicated by whatever it was that she was saying, but I couldn't understand or hear the words. And I asked her, who are you talking to? And she said, oh, you know, there are two angels sitting here beside me, and one of them just told me that you're going to become a writer. Metaphor did not have a place in that room at that time, and skepticism was not in my mind. What I felt was the largeness of something that she was very close to, and that was real. And any anxieties I had about what the world thinks about faith, or about the lens that I would prefer to use in thinking about belief, all of that went away. And I think what I felt was the largeness of my mother. You know, there were so many layers of being that we just don't understand, and something about the beauty and the transparency and the confidence that she felt at that moment, just saying, well, this is what's happening. I felt humbled, I felt frightened. There was a part of me that felt so very hopeful and affirmed, like, what if this is right? What if this is true? I've thought about that a lot, and there was something so harrowing and also so beautiful about writing it into being in language, because seeing it on the page, even, not thinking about anyone else reading it, but seeing it there, it was real, and there was something irrefutable about the fact that this had happened, and language anchored it to reality in a way that felt so beautiful.
And it felt like affirmation. We all want our parents to see us and love what they see. And the way she was talking to the angels, it was like, in the end, she told you, I see you.
I think it took me a long time to hear that. And in some ways, writing this book was about allowing myself to hear that and trust that that's what she was saying. In writing my last book of poems, which is thinking in some ways about the death of my father, I spent so much time, and I was much older when he passed away. I was in my late 30s, and I spent so much time saying that if my father is aware of me, of us, he's got to see us through this lens of sheer compassion. He's not worried. He doesn't have doubts or anxieties about my choices. He must just understand. And I'm sure that the kernel of that wish or idea must have taken root in that moment when my mother seemed to reveal that, even if I was too young to accept that that's what she was showing me.
I want to talk a little bit about your husband, who, like every other reader, I wish I could have known him. It just seemed like his joy for life and for living, the bright colors, the tea, the coffee, everything about him seemed to speak to a love of learning and life. And yet when he dies and you go back and you talk to so many people about the clogged arteries, one person tells you they thought the stress of his childhood was behind that. And I wondered how you reconciled that, because in the book it seems as though he almost closes the door when he's sad. He misses his mother. That's why he's crying. But he brings her colors and everything else to life. He doesn't seem to bring the bitterness or hurt, and yet it was in there.
Yeah, I think there are people here who are family and who knew him and loved him. In my life, I've met many people, and I've never met anyone who had seen so much suffering growing up during the very long and difficult civil war in Eritrea, Ethiopia, living through losing a brother. Every family member lost someone. Tremendous, tremendous struggle. Although also coming from an extraordinary family, coming from a magic garden of a childhood, which is part of what made the violence so painful in a way, because it was in contrast to very, very, very rich, loving, knowledgeable, textured family life. So having seen all of this, having left his country on foot at 16, having walked through killing fields, having seen classmates disappeared, on and on and on, he had the largest capacity for joy of anyone I ever met. And I wonder sometimes if people who have managed to survive, some of it is just the way some of us are made. Some people, the glass is half empty, other it's half full. It's different with different family members who have been through some of the same things, as we know, in the infinite wondering that I think we all do about our siblings and why, same parents, how come? But his capacity was quite infinite, and his sense of the privilege of every day, the privilege of life and what it meant then, and the privilege of coming to a resting place and making a family and building a family and not taking any of that for granted. So that in the daily meals, in the colors of the home, in the detailed conversation and intimacy with his children and so many others, that was a way of saying, I quote the poet Melvin Dixon, who was a mentor of mine, who died of AIDS at 42. What did you do? We lived, our open mouths about to sing, always. That sense of we're still here. And so I feel that has been, I'm actually built that way too, as it turns out. And I came that way, but then I took more of that from him, because I really feel, quite simply, what are we to do but live? What are we to do but live? None of us will outrun death. None of us will not know grief. We will know all of that. So what do we do with each day is something that I've been thinking about in the course of writing that book and in living through the last 3 years.
a lot of times in a romantic memoir, even if there's been great love in the aftermath, there's the question, how much of you didn't I know? These mysteries that I unravel, but that's not in this book. What's stunning is you're like each other's favorite old sweater. You seem completely known to each other.
Well, you know, we had a sort of, it was a magical coming together, but also it was something that we chose to enter fully. And so I think that immediate choice, we decided to get married after a week. I don't recommend that necessarily, but it was the right thing to do. We were both at a stage in life where what we wanted to do was make a family. Though we came from very different families, though we grew up, you know, and I write in the book thinking about, you know, what did it mean that our mothers were pregnant with us at the same time halfway around the world, and that we then came to find each other, but that happens every single day. It actually happens every single day. So it's both the extraordinariness of finding your soulmate and making a life with them, but also the ordinariness of it, and the choice. You know, the choice of saying, this is what we're going to do now, and doing it.
I find it interesting that you're people in your 30s, because the giddiness and the whirlwind is something I think we associate with teenagers and young people. Mm-hmm. But this has all of those smoked. I mean, this was great.
Well, yes. I mean, I think also the nice thing about being a little bit older is, you know, having made several really significant, as I call them, romantic missteps.
As we all have.
That I remember a friend of mine saying to me, a poet friend, of course, I said, so easy. I mean, this is just so easy. It's just so nice. I mean, he's just so nice, and we're just having a good time, and it's so easy. What's wrong? Something must be wrong. And he said that, like, no, actually, you know, not to say that all couples don't have their struggles, but that sometimes actually there is an ease to lean into, that's the point. That's how you know that, you know, because there's so much else we all have to contend with.
And Tracy, for you, the book seemed to be a part of your quest. Here's your mother. You were with each other from the beginning. You were with each other in the end, yet there was this quest to know her. When you're little, you say to her, who were you when you were younger? And she says, I was searching. And throughout the book, the theme of here I am, you're looking for her, that moment that says, here I am. What did that mean to you to go through all this? You could go through this whole life and still be saying, where are you?
In some ways, it reminds me of the beauty and the mystery and the vastness of the people that we love most and that we feel most secure with, you know. It's the same thing that you can feel so thrilled to disappear into, all of the facets of someone. I think when you're a child, that's just something that you don't think about, but that happens, and then you experience the largeness, you know, the literal largeness that is apparent for you, you know. But there were these moments, these windows, when ordinary curiosity would cause me to wonder, you know, my mother hasn't always been my mother. Who was she? I think I was never satisfied with that answer that she would give me. I was searching. And I think that she probably didn't, or maybe she imagined that there would be years and years to have that conversation where she could say, this is what it was like to be a young woman, and this is what you're experiencing. Let's talk as women. And, you know, sadly, we didn't have that opportunity. I think that the wish that informed the writing of this book for me was the impossible wish, you know, to go back and be able to ask and to see and to listen in the right way to all of the things that, if I were able to line them up next to one another, would create that 3D version of this person. I thought it was, I think one of the reasons why I didn't start this book, or why I could never fully get into it, I started lots and lots of chapters and pieces over the years, but I never could bring myself to feel like I was making or building something, because it seemed impossible. How would I do the research? You know, how I couldn't look up my mother, and who would I ask, and how would I, you know, it seemed like she was lost. And what I realized was that, you know, this is the thing that we want to believe, there's so much of the people that we love within us, right? I think that memory is one container for those people. When I was working on some of these small, tiny little memories that, I would sit down with and tell a version of and then go back to and see if I could just stretch it a little bit farther and find a little bit more of her inside of it, I realized that I was learning things about my mother, probably through the interesting kind of empathy that you have to lean into when you're writing. I would think about myself when I left home for college and all of the things I was dead set on experiencing and the wishes that I had. And I realized my mother must have contained her own version of those things as well. And even just speculating about that and putting her into the context of the world that she grew up in and speculating about what she might have wanted and wished for. I feel like my sense of her grew, and I discovered these little regions within myself that I had never found before, never spoken into. I wanted, to be able to ask her some really simple questions as a mother, and those are things that I never will be able to do, but somehow going back to my experience as her child seemed like the next best thing, in a way.
As much as the book is a memoir of her and religion is central to her, it's kind of an autobiography of your own journey with religion and ending up in a different place. And a poignant scene is when the whole church is giving you a hard time, essentially. And you sit there and you write, God is not that small, God is not that small. Your version of God, very different, it seems, than her version. When you look back now, what do you think about her version of religion? And it's all-encompassing. This is the thing that makes sense. Does it make sense to you, or do you still think, not quite a fit here?
Well, I don't think I could have my version of religion without hers. Mine was built of the terms that she gave me. And I think now about my mother growing up in the South, the Black church was a part of her, not only the family, but the community, something that held people together and that said there is justice, and there is order. And there are these rules and values that if we adhere to them, we can benefit from and we can protect one another. I really understand how it was important for her to pass that on to her children, and I can feel the effect of it. We were a family that was very close-knit and supportive and protective of one another, and that isn't always the case, and I think that there were any number of things that could have been different had she not insisted upon giving us this anchor. What I began to feel unease with were some of the external concerns that come with belonging to a community, especially a faith or like church-based community, where as much as what you are praying to is something that's yours and yours alone, what you are standing up and attesting to each Sunday is something that everybody can see. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of social anxiety. I understand, I have little children, and sometimes they're willful and they act out, and I'm humiliated in public, and I can understand how my mother wanted us to line up and be perfect, obedient examples of how effective a parent she was. I can understand there's space for ego in that. And those are some of the things that, as I needed more space for myself and that kind of individuation, those are some of the things that I bristled against. I think that as I've, gotten older, having lost both parents, having, also chosen to come of age in communities that are characterized by, artistic inquiry and by, like intellectual pursuits, I feel that there's something larger that I would like to align myself with, and it's not something that has as much, it's not something that is as human-seeming as the God that I was taught to believe. And I always think of the God on the Sistine Chapel, for better or worse. That's the image that comes to my mind. having surrendered both parents to whatever is out there, and having grown up also with a father who was really committed to science and who was interested in space as a real answer to some of those unanswerable questions, I want to imagine that whatever God is, or whatever the source is that I have no real choice but to believe in, that it's large enough to contain all of these things, to contain the human mind that wants to fashion it after ourselves, and to contain these mysterious systems that we have only just barely begun to recognize and understand. And I'm sure that in the next phase of my life, there will be something different that I need to fit into that, that category. And I'm really comfortable with that. I think that the humility of believing in something that we don't fully understand is probably the most important lesson that I would take from my mother, and her sense of religion, and her sense of why we are here and what we are beholden to. In a way, I feel like writing is another version of that, like there's this idea that language is a vehicle for something that we will never fully possess or understand, and yet it's this attempt to move closer and closer that heals and enlarges.
After your husband dies, you search out multiple explanations of what happened. And I found that fascinating, that you didn't want to just hear it from one source. You went through multiple sources, and those conversations pop up through the book. Why did you want to search out different answers?
Well, because it was so unreconcilable. It was so unreconcilable, and I still don't, there is no answer, right? Except that sometimes people just leave, and that having the answer doesn't bring them back. So that then, once again, you're back to the question of, well, how do you live, and what stays with you, and what's actually indelible? There's also, thinking about Tracy's book, there's a lot of questing for religion as a way to be told what to do, right? Mm-hmm. So having grown up, he grew up in Coptic Orthodox Christian, and didn't really actively practice that religion in his adulthood, though we were married in the Greek Orthodox Church. I grew up an Episcopalian, not doing much about that, but, being good to my neighbors. And so, there is all of this questioning, like, okay, well, today, I want to be Jewish today. What does it mean to sit Shiva? What does it mean to have rules? What does it mean for the neighbors to come after a certain amount of time and walk my family around the block? I want someone to do that. And it's I think, a way of thinking about Americanness. And if you don't live in a siloed community that is homogeneous and has been for generations and generations, which I hope we don't, I think that there's actually something very interesting to be said with, well, what does it mean to piece together, not in a frivolous way, the kinds of community rules and values that sustain us. And so one of the answers for me also is the religion of art and poetry and music and making it, and that is a form of prayer, and that I made my life with someone who was devoted to making art, and that was what we both did and supported each other in doing. And so that even in the months and months where I could not read, I could listen. After he passed away, I couldn't for many months. I could listen to music. I could let that wash through me and let myself feel something larger than myself. It wasn't comforting exactly, but it was movement through that art made possible. There's also a lot I've been very interested in, the village. I use that term a lot. And in extended family and in chosen family. One of the things that I found was very, very interesting is that I would see very, very clearly, sometimes some people are disappointing, and then some people come bearing extraordinary gifts. Mm-hmm. Many, 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 many amazing surprises. You don't know, small gifts, larger gifts, but you really don't necessarily know who is able to be helpful in these moments of extremity. So that's been a very, very beautiful process, actually. And I think in thinking about the ways that, you may be at some point in a family with a mom and a dad and 2 kids and you're nuclear and that's that, but none of us can ever assume that's the way we're going to spend our whole lives, because we mostly won't. Our children will leave, or they'll come back, or our parents will need us, or an auntie will come and stay with us, but this kind of fluidity with our families and understanding that it's actually, I think, you can have strength at the nuclear center, but you cannot be precious about the nuclear center, because it has to radiate outward, I think.
A lot of the book is about the constant conversation. You two meet, and it's a constant, I want to tell him, he wants to tell me. Mm-hmm. What do you find yourself talking about the most about him with your sons today? And is there something that makes you find yourself still talking to him in your head? That conversation goes on.
Everything. I mean, I talk to him all day long, and some of it is remembered and some of it is, and by the way, I talk to my grandmother, who was the most formative person to me in many ways, and who's been passed away for over 20 years. I think there's a way, and I find it actually very comforting, that when you know people that intimately, that their voice is within you. And that sometimes there is pain when you want to know, when you want to really talk, or when there's information sometimes that I think, there is nobody else who can tell me this, and you just live with that because there's no one else. I mean, you're talking about that with your mother. And I think with my children, one thing that was very important, and I don't know what told me to do this, but I just did it, is I didn't want there ever to be hushed tones about their father. Didn't ever want it to be, you'll make them sad, So we speak about him. We remember him. There in the book I say, well, that's a daddy question. When they ask me things that are not in my domain. Because we had quite the division of intellectual labor. We have very complementary knowledges. Like, you know what? The Peloponnesian War, I'm not the one. And why are you asking about the Peloponnesian War? But I just thought it was important that they always feel that they could speak freely, whatever that looked like, whatever that felt like, whatever that meant. And that they not feel that they had to tiptoe around that. Their father died, but they didn't lose their father. And those two things are true.
I could talk to them all night, but now I have to share. It's time for anybody else who has questions. There are people who have microphones on either side. Just raise your hand and we'll come down to you.
Greetings. I walked in here a little late. I did not know you were going to be here. I am a substitute teacher at the Philadelphia School Board. I'd like to know what any one of you ladies wouldn't mind coming to our drama class and speaking to the students. And it's up to you, so let me know.
Okay. I was in D.C. this morning. I was at Dunbar High School, where my grandmother went to school, which was quite a wonderful thing. So it's always nice to visit with young people.
I thought you were from Philly. I'm sorry, I didn't know you were from out of town.
You just felt that way. I think that's a good thing. That's a compliment.
But if you are available and it's not too hard to come to Philadelphia, let me know.
Okay.
Okay.
I would like to ask you both the same question. When you got into your memoir, or before you started it, whatever the case might be, what did you do with all that you had written at certain points in time and all that you hadn't yet put down on paper? I'm in the middle of a memoir right now, you might guess from my question. And I feel overwhelmed by all that I have written and all that is yet to be put down. And I'm wondering how you organize both of those things. What is there and what is not there. Could you just elaborate a little bit on the organization that you either had from the very beginning or that you found as you wrote? Thank you.
Well, what I can say is that for me, it didn't start with organization. It just started with writing, and I do think that just amassing material, just saying what you have to say, just getting it out, and crafting it, but getting it out. There's a time for that, and then there's a time for the shaping, and I think it's very, very individual. When it's time to with myself, each chapter is very, very short. They're poets' chapters, and I would print it out and make a pile and put it in a folder, but not look at it until I knew that if I looked at it and I didn't have what felt like it had a little bit of momentum, that I would lose my heart, and I wouldn't. So I waited until there was a whole lot before I even had a look at it, and at that stage, then thought about the shaping of it. I think it's actually important to go back and forth between the two energies, the very, very unfettered getting it out, but then the other energy that it takes to shape it. So maybe that's something to do, to step out and have some editing days and see where that takes you.
I thought that initially that I was going to write something that behaved much more organically and associatively, kind of like a poem. And I started writing in that fashion, and I realized I was getting a little bit lost, and that if I were simply to put things in order, even if they weren't going to stay in, like a chronological order, it could help me identify pockets of time that I might have overlooked. And it helped me narrow down the distance between one thing that I remembered and another thing that I remembered. And somehow that helped me, to retrieve more and more from memory. And I ended up leaving it in that order because the things that I discovered that I was interested in had to do with continuity and finding narrative and order where I had believed or imagined that it was just random and haphazard.
So you left it in chronological order?
For the most part, yeah. The other thing that I did have this mentor that helped me overcome a lot of the anxiety about switching genres and doing something that I had no idea how to do. And one thing that he was really firm about was telling me that everything didn't have to be in this story. I didn't have to tell my whole life story, that this was a book that had nothing to do with, whole regions of my young adulthood, and that it was a family story. Now, that doesn't undo the fact that writing these pieces or vignettes or whatever you want to call them maybe helped me to recognize things that were valuable even in earlier moments of my life, but that actual text ended up getting put away. Maybe it'll have another life at some point, and maybe it won't. There's something really wonderful about the idea that telling or exploring some things can help you dislodge other things that might, be buried a little bit more deeply. And that's an exciting kind of work to do. I like the idea that if you can write, like you said, without worrying about what it's adding up to right away, something might begin to accrue that later you can recognize and actually confront.
Wrote about people who were very important to you. Did you worry about sort of getting them right, what they would think about how you portrayed them?
I worried a lot about that. I worried about, because I have so many aunts and uncles and cousins, and I know I got a lot of things wrong as far as they're concerned. And what I believe happened is I told my story, and I shared a version of the woman that I knew as my mother, and she's probably different from the aunt that my cousins knew and the sister that my aunts know and remember, and that's okay. I think it's okay. What it really reminded me of is that, our lives are many lives, and there's something wonderful about the different versions of my mother that are still there, that have been unexplored, and that maybe someone else will write into being.
Yes, and yes. I mean, I worried less about what others would think, but more I worried about my doing my duty to be able to really, really portray at the height of my ability as a writer. To be able to do that kind of justice to this person, but also to our family. So in that regard. Many people have their angles of vision on him, and that is a beautiful thing. But I'm the only one who can tell the story from the inside of what our family was. And so when you realize that even as you're writing about someone else, you're also telling your own story and the story that only you can tell, and that, to be as careful and precise as you can with that then becomes what it means to try to make good art, because a good art, I think, comes from a place of tremendous emotional honesty and fidelity that is made manifest in superior craft. So that was what I was trying to do. I think with any writing, because not even just with this book, there have been other moments where I think, who will think this, who will think that. But I think that eventually you really have to lay that down and just say, did you write in an honorable way? Did you write with your heart? And also recognizing that once you've made it and sent it out into the world, that it is then yet another thing, as it interacts with other people.
I was wondering if, now that Memoir's had an opportunity to do the work that it's done with each of your stories, if you thought that you might return or revisit those stories in a different genre, perhaps in poetry.
Hi. Well, who knows, right? I mean, I think that, when you look at, it's really interesting when you look at if someone has a long and productive life as an artist of whatever kind, you see there are always preoccupations, things that we return to, things that we maybe tell from another angle. I've sort of, dramatically, like over dramatically, been saying, well, maybe I won't write poems anymore. Maybe that's just over. Maybe I don't do that anymore. I just feel like, I just wrote the hardest book of my life, and I feel grateful to be writing. So I'm not even thinking about the next syllable. I just feel like, the blessing of doing hard, good work. Thank you.
I feel like there were so many when I was a student, and even after graduate school, there was this idea that I somehow submitted to, that I had to profess my fidelity to a single genre, and so I was a poet, and I had forsaken any opportunities in prose, and even decided that those were inferior choices, and that strikes me as very silly. And what I realize now, having experienced some of the joys of working in this other, what to me really felt like a different language, and discovering the different ways that my mind and voice worked within that language, I'm eager to go back and forth. Hopefully, I'm eager to discover what other stories might lend themselves to prose, and how the experience of that might inflect some poems that I hope are not too far off either, but I'm trying not to think too much about it. For me, there's a natural silence that follows the completion of a project, and I think that might be a time when things get restored, questions begin to percolate again, and so I just want to let that happen.
You only get one shot with these questions, and I'd love to have this question be able to be cleaved so that each of you could run in with an answer, because I liked listening to both of you. But I have a feeling this is a little bit more of an Elizabeth question, though if you have anything to say on this, I'd love to hear it. But I'm really, taken by and as you certainly were too, and I almost feel I have to say this, I'm sorry for your loss because it's so richly conveyed, but it's the suddenness of it, the just an otherwise healthy person who is just instantly taken from you. And I guess I'm just trying to understand, is the art, the memoir that came out of that, is it different because of the suddenness as opposed to those of us who maybe are watching our parents in a kind of a 10-year decline, and it's no less poignant ultimately in the end, the loss, but it's not triggered in quite the same way as it would have been in this instance by the suddenness of it. And I'm just trying to, I'm wondering if you're realizing this is a different piece of art because of the way that he passed.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, and again, having more and more of these conversations, I am mostly interested in other people's experiences, because I feel that to each his or her own experience, I mean, you think, God, you suffer with someone, they're ill for years and years and years, and then still, I hear people who I know and people who I don't know say this all the time. It's not as though you're prepared. I mean, you're prepared, but you still are suffering a grievous loss. That said, I do think that suddenness and surprise it's its own thing, so perhaps there is something in the urgency and dislocation of that that perhaps put a kind of urgency and telegraphicness into the book. Just that feeling so very, very acutely of no time to waste. No time to waste. Say it, say it, say it. Do you have thoughts on that?
I really don't. I don't think. I mean, I can feel. I mean, as a reader who has experienced very different kinds of losses, when I was reading your book, there was something that was so vulnerable making, and I think part of it had to do with the intense beauty and joy that you share with the reader about this love and the way that the two of you came together. It caught me up in a sense of how quick our lives are and how blessed we are for what we receive. And I felt like as I was reading it, I just wanted to hug everyone to me because it made me very afraid also. And yeah, it's just a different thing. It's a different thing.
The last question I had written for both of you is, when you're memoirists, I would imagine there's something you want to say. You're saying it because you really want to say it, but there's something you want other people to hear. And the theme I keep getting from you is time is now. But what was it, if there was one thing that you want everybody to hear as they read your stories, what was it? Or is there not one thing?
That's such a good question, and I hope one day I know what the answer of it would be. I think that when I write, it's because I don't know what that is. And I feel like if I can say enough things, I might develop a sense of why this is on my mind, why this is itching at me. And but I never feel like there's a message that I'm capable of pronouncing. And I don't think, maybe pronouncing is the wrong verb, but for me, it was really just about wanting to believe that there was something that this absence created. And the more I could speak into it, the more I felt like it hadn't just taken something from me, but it had left me with something. Maybe that's helpful for somebody else.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't want to say one thing, and I certainly didn't write it to say something. I wrote it bit by bit by bit by bit by bit by bit to capture a lot of different moments that I think, very interestingly for me, are adding up to different things for different people. But one of the many things that I already knew that I discovered is that what art does is, it helps give meaning to life. It helps freeze moments. It helps us understand what this thing called life is and what we're doing together. And art is an attempt to grapple with that. And so just as I feel grateful for the art of other people, art of all kinds, I feel also glad that I can make an offering in that particular form.
I think we're down to the last question. Who would like to ask it?
I guess carrying on with that same idea, there is a structure in the fact that there are these lives that you've lived and other people have lived, and so coming from poetry, where I think there's more this idea of not having a full narrative, or there's writing into the unknown. How did you find it working sort of back and forth with like what is known and what you're working to find that's a surprise, that's different in working in memoir than writing a poem?
Well, I could say that actually for me it was the element of surprise was actually not much different. That the kind of word by word, not knowing where it's going to go, knowing that you're working with sounds, knowing that, you know, I start off by saying, well, does the story begin here? Does it begin now? Does it begin when he died? Does it begin when we met each other? Does it begin when our mothers were carrying us? Where does the story begin and where does the story end? And so with each foray into writing a bit of this book, I didn't know where the journey was going. And to me, as in writing poetry, that's what makes it a dynamic and alive process. That's what makes me feel so privileged that I'm a writer. I feel so lucky that I felt so lucky I had the companion of being able to write as I moved through this, because you may feel a certain way that doesn't have words, and then putting it into words, putting not even feeling or emotion, but perception into words, feels like a very, very grounding way to be for me. So I never knew what was around the corner. I never set out to do it a certain way, and in that way, it felt like the good way that writing poems feels.
I would definitely second that. You know, when you're working with facts, there are, you know, there's a terrain that is there, that happened, that was real, that you're returning to, but what you find there isn't always what you thought you had left there, and that was really exciting and terrifying, because sometimes, you know, what you find are things that you thought were, you know, taken care of, and they weren't, or they aren't, and yeah, I think language allows us to see what time, you know, like the forward movement of real time prevents us from seeing and dwelling on. You know, language is beholden to our patience and our ear for music, and we can stop and wait for the right question to ask of this thing is, and the combination of all of those things is completely surprising and ceaselessly fascinating. We tell the same story in 20 more years, and it'll be a totally different story.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We're going to head backstage, but then I believe both authors will be out in the lobby ready to meet you and sign books, so please head that way.